Good morning. I'm Steve Armstead. I work with the Xerces Society as a pollinator conservation specialist here in Colorado, and I'm also on the CPN steering team. When we came up with the theme for this year's summit, the idea of who should be our keynote speaker to set the stage for exploring new terrain for pollinator conservation was pretty clear. Eric Lee-Mäder just seemed like the perfect person to really think about where do we go from here. Eric is a co-founder and principal of Northwest Meadowscapes, a prairie seed company and meadow-making consultancy based in Washington State. His substantive career in conservation includes work as a director for the Xerces Society, where I had the privilege of working with him directly. While at Xerces and in prior endeavors, he has led multinational pollinator conservation initiatives with major food companies, partnerships with farmers and the USDA focused on federally endangered Karner blue butterfly, multi-watershed hedgerow planting efforts across the West, and nationwide native plant propagation research and development projects for large-scale habitat restoration. In his current endeavors, Eric continues to advise food companies on integrating conservation into their supply chains, and he is also focused on the development of wild lawn systems as alternatives to turfgrass. Eric is also an incredible writer and storyteller. You'll commonly see his name as one of the key authors on many of Xerces' books, including the popular Attracting Native Pollinators and 100 Plants to Feed Your Bees. His new book, The Milkweed Lands, just a copy of it up here, it was awarded the 2023 National Outdoor Book Award, and a book I thoroughly enjoyed reading. This book wonderfully demonstrates Eric's storytelling skill and ability to craft prose that connects us to pollinators, to places, and to the natural history of the two. Eric possesses rare skills and perspectives that help us blend ecology and agriculture. He's an outside-the-box thinker and is always wanting to push for new and bigger ideas, seek out new terrain for pollinator conservation. He also comes to conservation with a great sense of humor and heart. Eric, on behalf of CPN and all of us here in Colorado interested in pollinator conservation, we welcome you and thanks for being here today.
Thank you, Steve.
Did you have something?
I just wanted to mention real quick, I'm sure everybody will have tons of questions. We'll have volunteers around the edges with note cards and pens. If you have a question, raise your hand. We'll pass you a card, but please hold them till the end, and then we'll have plenty of time.
All right. Boy, 2 microphones. I'll start here. Steve, you really talked me up. I'm a dumb North Dakota farm kid, and at some point during the morning here, I'm going to fall off the stage. So that's who you're dealing with. I had to take boats and desolate logging roads to get here. I am still on ocean time. It's like 4 in the morning for me. And I have chronic insomnia. So that's what you're in store for today. Okay, I'm just going to dive in. I got a lot to cover. Normally, I make like 10,000 slides for a talk like this, and I run over time. I'm going to try not to do that today, although there's still like 10,000 slides. As Steve mentioned, I had a career, an infamous career, a career where on a daily basis I wondered whether or not I was going to get fired at the Xerces Society, where for a little bit less than 2 decades, I managed most of the private sector partnerships at the organization, primarily with the food industry, but also with the energy sector. Boy, that was a blast. Also work with the native plant nursery trade. I am now principal and co-founder of Northwest Meadowscapes, which is indeed a prairie wildflower seed of the Pacific Northwest. And yes, we have prairies and meadows there. I'll show you some beautiful examples of that at some point during the slide deck. Increasingly, we are doing more of our meadow consultancy around meadow installation, meadow management, and doing a lot more non-native seeds as well, which has some intersections with this talk, work with perennial grains, work with short season vegetables, and a lot of flowering turf, which is sort of an unexplored frontier in pollinator conservation. And it's a topic that I hope that you guys at this summit dive into at some point in the future. Okay, I'm going to begin with a long-winded personal history, and forgive me for this, but going back to 2001, I was spit out of the tech sector where I had a career in marketing where I went to work every day and wondered whether or not I was going to get fired. And at some point I did. And there were a bunch of reasons for that, which had to do with terror attacks with greedy business partners and a whole bunch of other kind of grim details. But as the overgrown kid who had, probably for his only talent, the ability to look at a plant or an insect just once and hear the name of the species, and from that point forward, always be able to recognize that animal or that plant, I had the idea that I should go back to grad school in commercial horticulture. I enrolled at the University of Minnesota, where I discovered that in a science-based department, the ability to recognize a plant through the Gestalt method really had no value. And so I turned out to be this complete outcast within the department, and like all outcasts, I sulked off to my corner. My corner turned out to be this concrete building next door with fallout shelter signs still affixed to the walls, where the entomology department was located, and in the basement was the University of Minnesota Bee Lab. The Bee Lab, unlike the horticulture department, paid me, it fed me, and it occasionally housed me. And all I had to do in exchange was get stung 1,000 times a day and drive around rural North Dakota with an Arab grad student and explain in a post-9/11 world why we were traveling with hundreds of gallons of formic acid. I left the University of Minnesota Department of Horticulture not really knowing anything about plants, but having a bit of a crash course in pollinators and bee biology. When I left the university, I entered what I call my wilderness years, where I spent a lot of time as an independent crop manager for a group of prairie seed growers in the upper Midwest, a group that I lovingly referred to as the Prairie Cartel or the Prairie Mafia, which is pretty much an apt description for that group of people. During this time, I was still applying for traditional jobs, including a job with a certain state extension agency where I was asked to give a presentation on the topic of my choosing, just because they wanted to see my presentation style and see if I was an appropriate fit for the extension service. I chose pollinators. I thought the interview went well. I thought the presentation went well. And afterwards, they pulled me aside and they said, you know, you seemed all right, but we really question the topic choice that you came in with. This obscure topic of pollinators doesn't seem like something that's going to resonate with our constituents, with our master gardeners, with our small farmers, with our rural landowners. A year later, in 2006, the news broke of this thing called colony collapse disorder, which then went on to dominate at least part of the news cycle for about 10 more years. And if you think about it, you probably remember this. In 2006 to about 2016, there really wasn't a day that went by where you couldn't find bees in the news. And this was a new thing for a lot of people. People didn't understand that, bees played such an important role in our food system and that bees were declining precipitously. And in the case of honeybees specifically, people were just waking up to the fact that this colony collapse disorder, this big pulse of insect losses, was layered on top of a longer-term decline in honeybee populations. And that for more than half a century, the number of managed honeybee hives in the United States had been in decline. People also didn't realize it at the time, but now looking retrospectively, we were seeing this phenomenon, this colony collapse disorder phenomenon with honeybees, occurring at a point where there was a dramatic change in the number of almond acres in California. And of course, most of you know this, almonds are the number one honeybee-dependent crop in the United States. And for many years, for many decades, the number of almond acres in California had kind of hovered in the low hundreds of thousands. Colony collapse disorder occurred at this accelerated planting time in the almond industry, where the industry was suddenly spiking and on track to plant 1 million acres in California. For context, this is one Central Valley county in California. Every one of those light blue polygons is an almond orchard. The non-blue areas are mostly other agricultural systems or urban areas. So where's nature fit into this? And of course, we went on to recognize as a community of practitioners, particularly those of us in the non-honeybee space, in the conservation community, we went on to recognize that the decline of pollinators was not a honeybee-specific phenomenon, that this was a widespread occurrence that affected virtually every species of butterfly, bee, a whole bunch of hoverflies, a whole bunch of other insects. And we coined this term, the insect apocalypse, which graced the cover of the New York Times Magazine back in like 2013, 2014. What we're also increasingly recognizing is that the decline in pollinators really mirrors a larger global decline in wildlife species. And for those of you who are not familiar with it, you might check out the Living Planet Index, which is this really interesting big data modeling approach, which every 4 years aggregates population surveys for thousands of species of animals across the world. And we're talking about freshwater fish in European rivers, tropical rainforest amphibians in South America, large mammals in the African savanna. And what we see is pretty clear and pretty stark, that over the past 40 years, and I don't know if I should reveal my age, but I am well above 40 years old, but in the past 40 years, in my lifetime, we have seen almost a 60% decline in the sheer numbers of animals that used to roam upon Earth's surface, swim in its waters, or fly in its air. So we are entering what many of us think of increasingly as a post-nature world, a world in which, for many people, the only access to significant forms of nature is through replicated depictions of nature, cave paintings of our time of nature. This is much like, you look at the monarch, and by the way, monarchs don't visit California poppy. You look at the monarch in this photo, this is very much like us making cave paintings of aurochs in the caves of Lascaux. So pollinator conservation became a movement in the wake of this. In 2008, we had the first farm bill, which specifically dedicated money through the conservation titles for pollinator conservation through USDA programs. We had consumer awareness campaigns, and I worked with Whole Foods on this one, where we went into a store, we took off all the produce from the store shelves that was dependent upon insect pollination for its production. And early on, and this is the crux of much of what I'm going to talk about, early on there was this recognition that pollinators were intrinsically linked to food. And in some ways, I think we've lost the plot in this conversation. So our response, what was our response? One of those responses was to go out and plant native plants specifically in agricultural areas, but also in community gardens and in a whole bunch of different places. And it's a good response. It's a totally valid response. And it is a response that we need to keep on track, that specifically should be the calling of all of us. But it's also a response that I have to ask myself whether or not we are succeeding with. This is a pollinator hedgerow, mile long, Central Valley of California, thick with native plants. But are we succeeding in this mission? Does that hedgerow, for all of its value, offset what's happening in those crop fields adjacent to it? Okay, let's dive into the specifics of food. And by the way, thank you in advance for inviting me here. I realize that anytime you talk about food with a diverse group of people, you run certain risks. Food is deeply connected to our sense of ourself, our sense of our health, our religion, our dietary preferences. So feel free to try and tar and feather me at the end of this. But food is important because the production of food occupies fully half of the Earth's surface, particularly when you include grazing animals and livestock into that equation. So this is, without question, the most significant force impacting terrestrial biodiversity on Earth. And for a long time, I just blindly assumed that that sheer abundance of agriculture was the factor, that the scale, the 50% of the Earth's surface devoted to agriculture, was the factor affecting biodiversity. And it turns out that for a long time, I was completely wrong, that it isn't really the scale. And in fact, if you look at things like pesticides, I didn't believe this, particularly because the research came out of China, and I'm always a little dubious of Chinese research. But then I started to look more broadly across the globe. And it turns out that large farms, if you just take pesticides, for example, are typically applying fewer pesticides per acre in terms of the sheer quantity for a whole bunch of different reasons, including better access to precision technology, greater policing of crop input costs. So scale hasn't really turned out to be the issue. The diversity of those farms, in fact, is the issue. And without question, and I included very few citations here, feel free to take pictures of them. I could have included slide after slide after slide of citations around this. Turns out that more diverse farms have more bees and more kinds of bees. And the reasons for this are pretty simplistic, pretty intuitive. But if you have a farm with a whole bunch of different crop types, then you have potentially different things flowering throughout the year. You've got this patchier landscape with more areas for nesting and reproduction and overwintering. You also typically have lesser pest pressure on more diverse farms because you're not operating in a monoculture environment where pest populations can quickly balloon. And the examples for this are beautiful in their granularity, beautiful in their specificity, and they are examples that you can specifically see. One of those examples that I find completely endearing and have for years and years is the two-spotted longhorn bee. I like to call it the Three Sisters bee because this is a bee that characterizes the value of diverse farm systems for pollinators. This is a bee that, yes, it actively gathers and collects corn pollen. I promise you that, but also squash and beans. Fascinating bee. And you have to wonder about the evolution of this bee and its connection to earlier landscapes. But it should also be clear that bee food is human food. And so if bees thrive on diverse farms and bees are also in decline, what does that say about the diversity of our farms? And what does that say about the diversity of the things we eat? Are we eating for bees? That's a blurry picture, but I couldn't not include it because where else are you going to see a disgusting pizza made out of chicken McNuggets, French fries, and 2 McDonald's hamburgers? At one point in time, all of agriculture was patchy and diverse. And there are still traces of these farm systems across the globe. This is the Bocage, an iconic landscape of Normandy. And those hedgerows that you see in this photo are the skeletal remains of the ancient forest. Those hedgerows have been there since this was a forested landscape thousands of years ago. And these fields that are intermittently used for grain crops, for grazing, particularly sheep, these were fields that were slashed and burned out of that primeval forest. So these hedgerows are this ancient skeletal forest landscape interwoven into agriculture. You don't get more diverse than that. This is also the landscape that was home to some of the most pitched battles following D-Day in World War II. There is film footage of some of those really, really bloody battles through these hedgerows. And yet today, if you want to see a rare butterfly in Normandy or a rare songbird, you go look in those hedges. These are very, very resilient landscapes. I promised you there were prairies and meadows in the Pacific Northwest, and indeed there are. And these arguably have mostly been anthropogenic meadows. These are farm fields. And the documentation of these goes back centuries. The earliest clear kind of Western English language documentation of these goes back to Lewis and Clark, where they came over the mountains into the inland Pacific Northwest. They were thirsty. They saw these beautiful blue lakes off in the distance and traveled over to them to discover that they were not lakes at all, but they were these open, sunny fields of camas, camassia, biscuit root, a whole range of other edible bulbs and tubers that native people dug. And along with salmon, this was the principal food source for native people. And this is, you got to be careful here, this gets controversial where I come from, but these were agricultural landscapes. These are human artifacts. These were farmed fields. And where they still exist, and there are about 1% of these still remaining, this is where you go if you want to see a rare songbird, Vesper sparrow, Oregon Vesper sparrow, or if you want to see a rare butterfly, Taylor's checker spot butterfly, a whole range of other endemic Pacific Northwest rare species. In my early 20s, I bumbled my way into a college admission in rural southern Japan, which did not meet my expectations. I thought that it would be like Blade Runner, and it turned out to be like this. I found myself in a kind of landscape in southern Japan called Satoyama. And these are widespread across the country. Satoyama roughly translates to the borderland between village and mountain. And these are semi-wild farm landscapes. These are the most common type of farming system in Japan. And they are adored by the Japanese people. Has anybody seen My Neighbor Totoro? Yeah. So that's a Satoyama landscape in that movie. And by definition, these are semi-wild farm systems where alongside rice and barley and vegetables, the farms are typically managing adjacent forest land or adjacent natural areas. They're managing forest land. They're doing selective timber harvesting out of those forests for things like charcoal or mushroom production. Japan is the only fully developed country, to my knowledge. Actually, I'm going to walk that back. Japan and Korea are really the only fully developed countries, to my knowledge, where you can walk into a major grocery store and alongside the carrots and the daikon and the tomatoes on the produce shelves, you can find wild vegetables, shrink wrapped in plastic right there ready for you to buy. And those come from these Satoyama farms. These farms have developed over such a long time frame, over thousands of years, going back all the way to the time that the sun goddess gave the Japanese royal family its 3 jewels. These farms have reached a point in which the wildlife of the landscape are dependent upon this form of agriculture. There are fish species that only spawn in these rice paddies. Turtles are the most common pest control mechanism that most farmers have in their rice paddies, turtles. Japan, as you know, has this aging population. A lot of these Satoyama landscapes are becoming ghost towns or ghost villages. People are dying out, and these are becoming abandoned. And as that happens, the forests are re-encroaching on the farms. Without the selective thinning of those forests, the understory within these woodlands becomes less diverse and more shaded. There are fewer insects, there are fewer songbirds. These are deep, dark, silent forests that are encroaching upon the landscape. So at its best, agriculture can enhance biodiversity. We also have this tradition in specifically the desert Southwest and the southern west coast of the United States down into Baja California of Pinole, of harvesting the seeds of wildflowers as a primary food source. I'm trying to think of the name. What is it? The Tara Humara? Does anybody know them? Like the mystical runners of Mexico? These people who ran as a form of prayer. They'd run all day long. They ate the seeds of these plants. It was a major source of their diet. Do you think this is a food system that's good for bees? Okay, let's move specifically into agriculture today. Because again, scale isn't the factor. Diversity is. And we have some opportunities ahead of us. I'm going to begin this section here by just referencing what we call in the food industry the ingredient deck of 2 breakfast cereals. These are real cereals. You can go to any big grocery store and you can buy these cereals right now. On the left, you have the breakfast cereal with the DNA of 2 species. Mostly one species, mostly corn, as you'll see. A little bit of sugar beet in there as well, so they're doing all right. On the right-hand side, you've got this breakfast cereal with 15 species in it. Look at all these. You got millet, you got barley, oats, all kinds of things in this. You got honey in it. Who the heck knows where that honey comes from? It comes from some flower somewhere. And of course, these breakfast cereals are represented upstream in the supply chain by farms. The 2 species breakfast cereal mostly comes from some kind of conventional farm. It comes, oh, and by the way, I just want to call your attention, because I failed to include it later on. Look at the zebra stripes in this farm here on the right. We'll come back to that. But the 2 species breakfast cereal comes from some farm like this. I don't know the farm, and I'm sure it isn't a farm. I'm sure it's like 10,000 farms all aggregated together through the commodities market. But we know that these farms exist, and we know that increasingly a lot of them are just corn on corn rotation. And that's what it looks like. And I think everybody here intuitively knows the inputs that go into a system like that. But Farm 2 is a real farm. And I actually know the farm, and I know the farmers. And it is in fact a semi-wild farm, much like that Satoyama system, but at a 20,000 acre scale. Again, scale's not the issue. Diversity is the issue. I call this a semi-wild farm because interspersed throughout all the crop fields are these prairie strips. And that's the zebra striping you're seeing from the satellite images. You're seeing these flowering strips between these fields. This is also a farm that in every one of those production plots, those long, skinny, narrow production plots, you're seeing spelt and emmer, but you're also seeing flowering things like buckwheat. You're seeing things like lentils and chickpeas. And by the way, if you want a crop that you don't have to spray nothing on, chickpeas are a good crop. This is also a farm system that interplants cover crops in rotation with those commodity crops. And to terminate those cover crops, they turn the cows loose on them. It's a semi-wild farm system with a lot going on. So it does all these different things. It's got livestock integrated into it. It's got native plants integrated into it. It's got more than a dozen crop species growing at any one time across 20,000 acres and supplying breakfast cereals and pasta brands and a whole bunch of different things. And yet, this is still how most farms in our country look and operate. And in fact, I hate to break it to you, but this is probably the more profitable farm system. So something is wrong. And let's talk about how we fix that. There are no no barriers with public interest in doing this. I'm sure that every one of you out here, if you're presented with the choice of eating something that's good for biodiversity versus something that isn't, you're going to choose the thing that's good for biodiversity, especially if all else is equal. And in fact, this is the larger consumer sentiment. For a long time, we had no real evidence for this other than sort of a gut feeling. But in recent years, there's been actual peer-reviewed university, not market-based research, but university research on consumer preferences. And it turns out that the average person, the people who are not here, the people who may not know a bee from a fly, but who followed that 10-year news cycle between 2006 and 2016 and heard about bees in decline, that those people are willing to pay a little bit more, and they're more willing to select something that's good for bees and good for biodiversity. And a whole bunch of different brands have made at least incremental efforts to try to support pollinators in their supply chain. And you can see those brand logos down here. And I am in no way lionizing those brands because every single one of them has a hell of a lot more work to do. But we have the tools to do this. We have, for example, minimally improved crops. We've got a whole bunch of different things out there that you really don't need to spray with a whole bunch of insecticides, a lot of which produce pollen or nectar that bees will visit, and a lot of which lend themselves well to those weird rotation periods between our common agronomic crops. These minimally improved crops are super, super valuable. And in fact, I'll just cut to the chase. If we lived on a diet of borscht, buckwheat pancakes, and bison, we'd all be a lot better off, and the bees would be a lot better off. We also have the tool of growing our food in more wild ways. This is a maslin crop. Is anybody familiar with maslin production systems? Yeah. This is an interplanting. And in this particular case, I think there's like a dozen different varieties of emmer and spelt all co-planted as a single crop, harvested together, processed together. And because each one of these plants growing within that mixed field has different genetics, they have different pest pressures that they face, and you end up with a more resilient crop and one that is basically immune to things like Russian wheat aphid. We can plant our vegetables in similar ways, at least in the home landscape. This is a friend's garden, not the best photo, but this is a friend of mine. This is how they plant their vegetable garden, and there's a bunch of us now in my community planting our vegetable gardens this way, where we put together the seed of like 30 different species of vegetables and we just hand scatter it in the garden bed. And then you get in there on your hands and knees, or in my case, you send your kids in there on your hands and knees. And you come out with basically a grocery cart full of vegetables every week. Pest pressure is zero. We have the tool of conservation grazing. Aldo Leopold talked about what was it, his 5 tools of conservation? I don't even remember them all. The gun, the axe, fire. One of them was the cow. Despite being from North Dakota, I don't know anything about grazing. I ran away from that as quick as I could. But there are people who are experts in this. One of those, my friend David Kerr there, who you see pointing in the photo on the right, is showing the impact of conservation grazing on his prairie system in Oklahoma. And there are people who are experts in this, in grazing for biodiversity. Europe is doing a ton of interesting work with this, including the attempt to rewild cattle to recreate something like the auroch, this ice age wild ungulate that was considered to be this keystone species in terrestrial ecosystems across the continent. Europe's also doing some work with their bison, and we should be doing more work with our bison as well. The effects of bison on the landscape can be transformative. As some of you know, you look just simply at things like bison wallows and what that does to the patchiness of the land, to the plant communities. It's really, really fascinating. We have tools to document how our food is impacting pollinators as well. And one of those tools, one that I worked closely with a brilliant team at Xerces on, is Be Better Certified. Be Better Certified is a food labeling and certification system like organic, and organic is great. Be Better adds a whole other layer to food documentation and food certification by demarcating farms or ingredients that come from farms that provide habitat for pollinators, that protect pollinators from pesticides, and farms that have nest sites, actual documented nest sites for pollinators on them. And there are mainstream brands today that provide Be Better certified products. You can go, for example, to Costco. You can pick up Silk almond milk, Be Better certified Silk almond milk. In season, you can pick up Be Better certified blueberries. This is a program that has now spread outside of the United States, and we have Be Better certified farms in places like South America. This is a long, slow fight that we have gone through. Shouldn't say fight, but a long, slow campaign, but one that is producing remarkable transformation in agricultural systems. We also have a food system that has a really interesting pinch point to it. There are, of course, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of farms in the United States. We have a food system with millions of consumers in the United States, but we have a food system that is largely dominated by 11 companies in the retail space in our supply chain. And if you follow the news, you know that the retailer point in our food system is about to be consolidated even more. And this gives us an opportunity, if we can engage retailers, and this is something that Xerces has done, it's something that the Center for Food Safety has done, the Center for Biological Diversity has done some work on this. There are a bunch of organizations out there that periodically have tried to apply pressure to the retail sector. But this, because retail is so central here, food companies will do a lot to have their products placed in particular ways and to have particular volumes bought by major retailers, by Costco, Kroger's, Walmart. And it's time for a larger retail campaign to influence the work that these retailers do and drive conservation back upstream through the supply chain. The other thing that we can all do is we can forage, fish, and hunt abundantly. There is a tremendous case to be made for the conservation value of wild foods. By nature, just like that Satoyama example, by nature of continuing to have these things as part of our diet, we have to conserve them. And there are some excellent examples of this. And there are excellent examples of people working specifically to highlight the opportunity of foraging for invasive species. There is an old native saying, this is a camas field again, by the way, in the Pacific Northwest. There's an old saying among the native people in that region with these camas fields that the more you dig these, the better they do. And that's true. There's some reasons for that. And I think there's a lot of foraging, fishing, and hunting systems out there that we could make a similar case for. The other thing that you can do is you can put as much DNA on your plate as possible. The diversity of our food system will only occur when we start to eat in more diverse ways, when we move away from the chicken McNugget pizza. And of course, this food is beautiful to look at. And again, if we lived more on a diet of buckwheat pancakes, borscht, and bison, the landscape would be quite a bit different for bees. Not to mention different for your own health. And you all intuitively know this. I'm no health expert. I've made more than my share of poor food choices in my lifetime. But we all know intuitively that the more diverse you eat, the more it influences your own personal sense of health. The last thing that you can do here is you can position food as central to the pollinator conservation movement, alongside planting habitat, alongside working to reduce the impacts and the widespread use of insecticides. Again, I think we've lost the plot. You know, I look around at what we're doing for pollinators, at No Mow May, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with. Not to diss on No Mow May, but between changing our food system and letting your dandelions grow in your front yard, where are we having the biggest impact on bees? If we can leave the leaves as a rallying cry for pollinators, I think we should be able to have eat for bees as a rallying cry as well. Amazingly, I got through this in under an hour and a half.
Thanks so much, Eric. That was a tremendous talk. If anybody has questions, we'd ask that there are volunteers along the sides of the walkways. Raise your hand. They can give you a card to write it down.
I'm good with criticism, too.
I'll just start out with a comment to say that was an excellent way of presenting a very complex and socially fraught issue, because we do take food so personally in so many instances.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay.
All right. Oh, we're getting cards. I was going to say just shout them out, but. Okay. See, I don't have my reading glasses. I went through this whole slide deck without my reading glasses. If there was a mismatch between what I talked about and what you saw, I apologize. Okay. Slow food promotes all of this. Why not a partnership? Yeah, I don't know. I don't know anyone at Slow Food. You clearly do. Make that partnership. I will also say that there are other great organizations working in the space. The Land Institute in Kansas. I don't know how many of you are familiar with. I mean, they're famous for like the perennial grain work, but some of the work around these polyculture systems, co-planting sunflowers, perennial grains, native and non-native legumes as a single mixed crop and harvesting them. It's fascinating. There's also the Savannah Institute out of Wisconsin and Illinois, planting tree crops as a kind of a future commodity in hopefully a post-corn world, where we start to build a food system around things like chestnuts and pawpaws. Really interesting. Okay, next question.
I've got a whole stack for you.
read
I'll
them to
interpret. Yeah, so, I mean, simple, basic question. Can you give some more examples or details about how veggies and flowers are interplanted?
Well,
A good example.
that's a very specific how-to question. I can tell you in my case, there's no logic or rhyme or reason to it. Interestingly, my seed business, and I'm in no way promoting it, but my wife and I went through several seasons of just trialing what grows well together. And we did discover that at a certain point, the squash makes it impossible for anything to grow underneath. But yeah, it's trial and error. There's the classic Three Sisters system, but you can Google around, and common search term is like a chaos garden, which is I guess an apt description. There's some beautiful examples of this. Our vegetables out of our garden are all misshapen and weird, but delicious, and we never spray it.
Okay, so I think on that would be a good follow-up question. Somebody had asked, do native pollinators actually pollinate food crops? What about Three Sisters?
Well, okay, so we had the Melisodes bimaculatus. You all know this. Anybody growing a vegetable garden, you're seeing the bumblebees in there. You're seeing the halictids in there. We're seeing the squash bees in there. We have a food system, that where native plants do play a significant role, at least in the home garden setting. Our squashes, our vacciniums. These are a lot of our peppers, our tomatoes. These are native North American plants, and these co-evolved with pollinators of our landscape. And we should be eating more of those things. We have, 500-ish, I should know this specifically, 500-ish temperate food crop species that we could be eating. And what do most of us eat? You know, most of the biomass that we consume is about 12 different species of organisms: rice, corn, wheat, pork, chicken, beef, apple, carrot, cucumber, or tomato, lettuce. I mean, you eat the other things too, but not in significant quantities. How many of us eat wild rice every day? Okay.
We've got a whole series of questions here about how, like, people can pressure food companies or retailers to see the kind of products like bee-friendly labels.
Yeah. Okay. This is an excellent question. With the advent of Be Better, we have actually a specific thing that we can point retailers to. And retailers are, in fact, more responsive than you would think to consumer activation. And a specific example I can give you, it's not a food retailer, but a food brand, is Haagen-Dazs. Haagen-Dazs, for many years, I'm sure you saw, the Haagen-Dazs Loves Honeybees campaign. And that campaign came about because of a publicity stunt on the part of the brand where they spent $1,000 and gave a donation to a university bee lab. And they got a small tidal wave of social media heat over that. And small, I mean like just a few hundred people poked Haagen-Dazs online and said, tell us more about what specifically you're doing for bees, because this doesn't smell right. Haagen-Dazs turned around and invested when all's said and done, about $1 million in pollinator conservation, specifically in almonds in California and strawberries on the West Coast, which were the ingredients in their supply chain that were having the largest impact on pollinators. Few hundred people unlocked millions of dollars, and a few hundred people could do the same with the major retailers, with Costco, with Whole Foods, with Kroger's, Albertsons, and those four specifically are great targets. And if you have any role in community activism, in mobilizing constituents, those are great targets for you to poke. And we have some evidence that particularly the online campaigning works.
Okay, how about a really hard one?
Okay.
Since you're not afraid to tackle really hard questions, we've got a good one about the role of subsidies in our agriculture, and not necessarily from one direction, but how you may be able to leverage them as a tool to increase the diversity of smaller farms.
Oh boy. See, this is one from my former colleague Mace at Xerces, who is our government affairs specialist. I have tried to divorce myself from the Farm Bill as much as I can. So this one's a bit above my pay grade, but we do have a allocated funding pool for specialty crops in the Farm Bill, and that Farm Bill is overdue. So this is something you can specifically talk to your representatives about, and specialty crops is the key word. And the more we can put a focus on specialty crops, the more we change the landscape, not just for bees, but for a whole bunch of things.
Well, and I was wondering if maybe all this can tie together in terms of how we convince farmers to add diversity as a component of what they're farming for, when you've already admitted that oftentimes it's not as much of a moneymaker.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think that sea change is going to come about through the agricultural community. So I have a whole separate world as a farmer myself. I don't know, are there other farmers here? Not a lot. Holy moly. No wonder I feel completely out of place. Yeah, this is one where I think farmers working specifically with other farmers is the key to making this happen. I am part of a agroforestry group in the Pacific Northwest. So in addition to everything else, every other crazy thing I do, I grow apples in Washington State. Very weird system. I grow them in a saltwater estuary on a native crabapple rootstock. It's not something I recommend. But it's been an incredible platform for us to build a small agroforestry movement. And I think we need to elevate the farmers that are doing this, because farmers listen to other farmers. And as part of our organization, we went from a half dozen people doing crazy things to now dozens of farmers that are putting in a few acres of mixed agroforestry crops and diverse fruiting shrubs, aronias taking off, elderberries taking off. And it's because we've provided a platform for other farmers to come out and see what we're doing and make it a little less scary.
Talk about rewilding agriculture. That's crazy. Also had another question. I know it wasn't your expertise, but interested in grazing as a conservation tool, and why exactly there are differences between cows and bison.
Boy, I'm getting all the hard questions. And again, I've avoided livestock ever since I had to raise a sheep for 4-H. So this one is definitely above my pay grade. But we do, clearly bison are hardier animals, they're more adapted to our landscapes, and we can deploy them in different ways. That said, I do want to say something about grazing, because, and this may be controversial here in a state with a lot of grazing, but there are places that livestock should not be. And thank you for that. I thought I was going to get things thrown at me. But grazing is not a one-size-fits-all solution. And the question of bison versus cattle, the question of here, there, where should these animals be, is a very nuanced one. And it's one that I think there needs to be a larger conversation about. Even in the inland Pacific Northwest, I see, suddenly these what they call themselves conservation grazing advocates, grazing lands where bison have never been, let alone cattle. So that's not an answer, but it is a nuanced question, and I defer to the experts on it.
I'll throw out one last question. So there's been a lot about native seed availability. I'll wrap this up into a question which I had, which is, you had early on examples of the seed mafia, right? Mm-hmm. And now you're talking about rewilded systems. So do you see potential, or is there already people that are working on both food and seed production out of their agricultural systems?
I love this question. I am. Yeah, and this is something I actually know something about. Wow. Yeah, there are people who are doing this. And in fact, many of the native seed producers out there are growing food crops in rotation with native seed. Oftentimes not the food crops I would like to see. A lot of soy planted in rotation in Minnesota, Wisconsin, Iowa with native seed crops, a lot of corn. But this is a huge opportunity for us. And I think more significantly, the opportunity lies in the other direction, in taking growers who are planting food crops and encouraging them to plant some of these native seeds as a diversified alternative income stream, because that opportunity is real, particularly in the West. There has not been a single year, to my knowledge, where agencies like the Forest Service and BLM have been able to buy specifically every species that has been spec'd for reclamation or wildfire revegetation in the quantities that they needed. That market is enormous, particularly in the West. And if you know farmers who are interested in a white knuckle income stream, that market's real, and it's sitting there waiting to have more entrance into it.
Awesome. Any last thoughts for the group?
Thank you all for putting up with me. I appreciate the wonderful work that each one of you is doing in your own communities, in your own professional circles. Go forth, have a great conference, and I look forward to seeing the incredible things you folks do across this state. So thank you.
Everybody, thanks so much, Eric.